Pope John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła, the Polish Pope, who traveled the globe, helped bring down communism in Eastern Europe, inspired millions with his charisma, and was ultimately declared a saint. His face is one of the most recognized on earth, synonymous with faith, endurance, and moral leadership for vast numbers of people. He reigned for over 26 years, one of the longest papacies in history, leaving an indelible mark on the Catholic Church and the world stage. His canonization in 2014 solidified his legacy as a towering figure of the 20th century. But beneath the accolades and adoration lies a more complex, and for many deeply troubling picture. Because alongside the triumphs and inspiration, John Paul II's papacy was marked by decisions, policies, and silences that drew fierce criticism, caused profound suffering for some, and left behind controversies that continue to echo today. This isn't about tearing down an icon, but about understanding the full, often contradictory reality of a hugely influential leader. Controversy. Number 1. The defining shadow, handling the clergy abuse crisis. This is, without doubt, the most damaging and persistent criticism of John Paul II's papacy. While the abuse itself spanned decades prior, it was during his long reign that the global scale of priests sexually abusing minors and the systematic cover-up by bishops exploded into public view, particularly in the later years. Critics argue John Paul II's response was tragically inadequate, far too slow, and prioritized protecting the Church's reputation and shielding accused clergy over protecting children and supporting victims. The prevailing culture within the Vatican under his leadership, they contend, was one of denial, secrecy, and minimizing the severity of the crimes. Canonical processes were often used to protect priests rather than remove them. A key accusation is that the Vatican under his watch failed to implement effective global policies to remove abusive priests from ministry. Instead, bishops frequently engaged in what became known as passing the trash, quietly moving abusive priests from one parish to another, allowing them access to new potential victims, often without warning the new community. High-profile cases exemplified the problem. Cardinal Bernard Law of Boston, a close ally of John Paul II, presided over a diocese where shuffling abusers was rampant. He was eventually forced to resign in disgrace, but was then given a prestigious position in Rome by John Paul II. This move was seen by critics and victims groups as a profound betrayal and a sign that accountability was secondary to loyalty. Perhaps the most egregious example involves Marshal Masiel de Toledo, the founder of the powerful Legionaries of Christ order. Despite credible allegations of decades of sexual abuse of seminarians, and even his own children, financial corruption, and drug abuse reaching the Vatican, Masiel remained in John Paul II's favor, praised as a model of orthodoxy. Investigations were reportedly stalled or suppressed during JPA's papacy. Only under Pope Benedict XVI was Masiel finally disciplined. Supporters of John Paul II argue he was poorly informed by advisors, that he trusted bishops too readily, or that he viewed the accusations through the lens of communist-era disinformation campaigns aimed at discrediting the Church. Some point to his eventual meeting with U.S. cardinals in 2002 and slightly stricter guidelines issued late in his papacy as signs of evolving awareness. However, for critics and countless survivors, these defenses ring hollow. They argue the scale of the problem, the number of warnings received over decades, and the institutional culture of cover-up point to a systemic failure of leadership at the very top. The immense suffering caused by abusers, allowed to remain in ministry, remains the darkest legacy associated with his time as Pope. Controversy number 2. Conservative clampdown, social and doctrinal issues. John Paul II was doctrinally conservative, and his papacy saw a firm reinforcement of traditional Catholic teachings on sexuality, gender roles, and bioethics, often clashing with prevailing secular views and even dissenting voices within the Church. Contraception. He forcefully reaffirmed the Church's ban on artificial contraception, as outlined in the 1968 encyclical Humanae Vitae. Critics argued this stance was unrealistic, contributed to population pressures and poverty in some regions, and most controversially, hindered efforts to combat the AIDS epidemic, particularly in Africa, by discouraging condom use even for disease prevention. Supporters maintained this was a matter of upholding fundamental moral truths about the sanctity of life and the nature of marital relations. However, the perceived inflexibility on the condom issue drew condemnation from public health organizations, and even some within the Church who saw it as prioritizing dogma over saving lives. John Paul II's Vatican consistently described homosexual acts as intrinsically disordered and sinful. While calling for compassion towards individuals, the official stance opposed gay rights, same-sex marriage, and gay adoption, contributing to continued discrimination and hardship for LGBTQ+ Catholics and individuals globally, critics argued. While praising the feminine genius, John Paul II definitively shut the door on the possibility of women's ordination to the priesthood in his 1994 apostolic letter, Ordinatio Sacerdotalis, declaring the issue closed. He reinforced traditional gender roles and resisted calls for greater female leadership within the Church hierarchy. Critics saw this as upholding sexism and limiting women's full participation. For conservative Catholics, these stances represented a courageous defense of timeless truths in the face of a morally adrift secular culture. For liberal Catholics and secular critics, they represented an out-of-touch rigidity that caused unnecessary suffering and alienated many from the Church. It was a clear drawing of lines in the sand. Controversy. Number 3. The battle against liberation theology. Emerging primarily in Latin America, liberation theology sought to apply Christian faith to liberate people from social, political, and economic injustice, often emphasizing solidarity with the poor and challenging oppressive structures. John Paul II, however, viewed it with deep suspicion. Why the opposition? John Paul II, shaped by his experiences under Polish communism, saw dangerous parallels between liberation theology's analysis of class struggle and Marxist ideology. He feared it politicized the gospel, undermined church hierarchy by empowering lay communities, base communities, and focused too much on earthly liberation at the expense of spiritual salvation. His papacy took concrete steps to curb its influence. Key liberation theologians like Leonardo Boff were officially silenced or disciplined by the Vatican's doctrinal watchdog, then headed by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict XVI. Conservative bishops, often more aligned with established political and economic elites, were appointed throughout Latin America, displacing more progressive figures. Critics argue this crackdown stifled voices advocating for the poor and social justice, effectively siding the institutional church with oppressive regimes and economic inequalities in many Latin American countries. They saw it as a betrayal of the gospel's preferential option for the poor, prioritizing institutional control and anti-Marxist ideology over solidarity with the suffering. Controversy number 4. Geopolitics, dictators, and dollars. John Paul II played a widely praised role in the collapse of communism in Poland and Eastern Europe. His visits, his support for the Solidarity movement, his moral challenge to totalitarian regimes, these are undeniable parts of his legacy. But his political engagement wasn't without criticism elsewhere. Critics point to perceived double standards. While fiercely opposing communist regimes, his response to right-wing dictatorships, particularly in Latin America, was often seen as much more muted or even accommodating. His 1987 visit to Chile, ruled by dictator Augusto Pinochet, caused controversy when he appeared with Pinochet on a balcony, a moment used by the regime for legitimacy. Similar criticisms were raised regarding his interactions with, or lack of strong condemnation of, the military junta in Argentina during the Dirty War. While condemning violence generally, Critics felt he didn't sufficiently challenge these regimes or stand strongly enough with their victims, perhaps prioritizing the institutional church's survival or seeing communism as the greater evil. Then there were the lingering financial scandals. While the major IOR/Banco Ambrosiano scandal broke before his papacy, its architect Archbishop Paul Marcinkus remained influential in the Vatican for years under John Paul II. Questions persisted about transparency and accountability at the Vatican Bank throughout his reign, contributing to an image of financial opacity, even if direct papal involvement wasn't proven. Controversy number 5. The saint-making factory and institutional power. John Paul II dramatically accelerated the process of beatification and canonization, creating more saints and blessed figures than nearly all his predecessors combined over centuries. Critics dubbed the Vatican a saint-making factory under his tenure. Why the criticism? Some argued, devalued the process, making sainthood seem less exceptional. More pointedly, critics noted that many of those fast-tracked were founders of conservative religious movements or figures aligned with John Paul II's traditionalist theological leanings. A prominent example was the fast-track canonization of Josemaria Escrivá, the founder of the conservative and controversial organization Opus Dei. John Paul II also elevated Opus Dei itself in 1982, granting it the unique status of a personal prelature, effectively giving it global jurisdiction independent of local bishops. This move significantly boosted the influence of a group known for its doctrinal rigidity, secrecy, and intense recruitment methods, further consolidating conservative power within the church structure, according to critics. These actions, the rapid canonizations, the elevation of groups like Opus Dei, the appointment of conservative bishops worldwide, were seen by critics as part of a deliberate strategy to reshape the church in his conservative image, marginalize dissenting voices, and centralize power back towards Rome after the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. So how do we make sense of Pope John Paul II? He was undeniably a figure of immense global stature, deep personal faith, and historical consequence. His role in challenging communism is undeniable. His personal charisma inspired millions, yet his papacy is also deeply shadowed by the catastrophic failure to adequately address the clergy abuse crisis, a rigid enforcement of conservative social doctrines that alienated many, a crackdown on dissenting theological voices and political decisions that drew sharp ethical criticism. Was he intentionally malicious? Few would argue that. Did his decisions, regardless of intent, cause profound harm and contribute to crises that still plague the Church? The evidence strongly suggests yes. Understanding Pope John Paul II requires moving beyond simple hero worship or outright condemnation. It requires acknowledging the charisma and the controversies, the inspiration and the institutional failures, the global triumphs and the profound suffering linked to his tenure. History, especially the history of powerful figures, is rarely black and white. What part of John Paul II's legacy stands out most to you? The positive or the controversial? How should we evaluate complex historical figures like him? Share your thoughts below. And for more challenging looks at history's giants, hit subscribe.